Hi guys, my name is Brad and I'm just a normal Brazilian dude trying to improve my English by reacting to stuff that I like. Maybe I like because a lot of the things I react I don't really watch it yet. And this one is a example. I never watch any videos of PBS. I don't know them, but 2.8 million in one day is pretty good. And the title is very interesting. It's a line between two islands in Indonesia that, keep two worlds apart. I don't know what is that about, but I really like no stuff. Sorry, I'm drinking coffee. I'm getting ready to go to the gym, and let's go.
In between two of the islands of Indonesia, there's an ancient line that is both real and not real. You can't see it, but it's there all the same. If you stood on the coast of Bali and looked
I I have to stop because I like not only I like the video to watch a video, but I like how they tell a story. They started like getting our attention to a situation, and for the do is explaining. I don't know, guys. I'm just trying to speak to improve my English. So I maybe talk too much, but that's the idea of the channel.
east to the shores of Lombok, you'd be staring right at the line's narrowest point, a 32-kilometer stretch of water that seems pretty unassuming. This invisible barrier weaves its way through the entire Malay archipelago, their largest collection of islands on the planet. See, on the western side, the animal life is characteristic of Asia, featuring rhinos, elephants, tigers, and woodpeckers, to name a few. But cross the line, and things suddenly change. You won't find those same species on the eastern side. Instead, the islands have a totally different cast of ecological characters,
It's another world.
including marsupials, Komodo dragons,
It's like MMO, and you have one. How can I say that in English? But you have one region, and you have another region, and it's completely different.
cockatoos, and honey eaters. This is what scientists call a biogeographic boundary, the meeting point of two regions of biodiversity that are highly distinct. And this particular line, called the Wallace Line, is perhaps the sharpest and most iconic of all. So how did this invisible line come to be? Why does it shape the distribution of so many species? How did we figure out the path it takes? And how could it be both real and
not real.
imaginary? The Wallace Line was first sketched out in 1859 by a guy named, wait for it, Wallace. Alfred Russel Wallace, to be exact, a British naturalist who you might have also heard of as the co-discoverer of natural selection. That concept came to Wallace in a literal fever dream as he lay bedridden with malaria during part of his 8-year trip around the Malay archipelago. And while he'd end up being overshadowed by Darwin on that front, the second best idea he had on that trip was the existence of the Wallace Line. I mean, two good ideas in one trip.
It's it's pretty crazy, Two very powerful minds trying to know stuff. It's very interesting.
This idea helped to forever establish him as the father of biogeography, the study of the distribution of living things. He had spent his voyage observing and collecting as many species as he could, hopping from island to island across almost the entire archipelago. And it was as he moved east from Bali to Lombok that he first noticed something intriguing. Even though the islands were separated only by a narrow strait, the change in animal life wasn't gradual and subtle. It was sudden and distinct. Wallace saw the differences in animal life between the two as being even more striking than between England and Japan. It was birds that initially caught his attention. Certain species that were plentiful on Java and Bali, like the yellow-headed weaver, coppersmith barbet, and the Javanese three-toed woodpecker, didn't exist at all on Lombok. And this abrupt shift extended to mammals and even many insects too, almost as if an invisible barrier was separating two different worlds. But why and how? The biogeographic line that he drew, which others would tweak in later years, didn't just reflect the proximity of the islands. In fact, some islands on opposing sides of the line are closer to each other than many islands on the same sides are to one another. So Wallace realized that other more mysterious forces must be in.
It it's interesting because the birds can fly to another island. I don't know. Maybe he will explain.
Play, like, say, geology. He recognized that the geological past shapes the biological present. And because the distribution of living species today partly reflects ancient geological events, he saw biogeography as a way to uncover epic chapters of the planet's history that might otherwise have been unknowable. These concepts are easy to take for granted today. We talk about them all the time here on Eons. But they were still fairly new ideas in Wallace's day. And by taking this perspective, he concluded that the Western Islands must have once all been connected to each other and to the Asian mainland. While today they're surrounded by shallow seas, this is only the result of a geologically recent rise in sea levels. How else could
Guys, I'm silencing because I'm trying to understand. It's a complex. How can you say that? It's a complex. I forgot the word, but it's not easy to understand, and it's in English, and English is not my strongest language. I have only one, Portuguese, but whatever. I'm silent because I'm really paying attention.
the big animals of that side, like tigers and rhinos and tapirs, have ended up on the islands because they're now separated by expanses of water that are way too wide for those species to cross? He had a similar thought about how the islands east of Java and Borneo had formed. At least some of them were the remnants of a former Australian continent. Wallace had a hunch that, throughout all of that change, deeper waters with strong currents between the two regions must have prevented many species from crossing from continent to continent when sea levels were lower. And this is still preventing many species from crossing today when sea levels are higher and the continents are fragmented into neighboring groups of islands. Even many flying bird and insect species obey the line, ones that aren't capable of crossing those stretches of open ocean. Wallace had pulled together many pieces of the puzzle, but he and other scientists at the time were missing one key idea to complete the picture: plate tectonics. The surface of the planet is not static, of course, it's dynamic. It's made up of individual large sections or plates that move and collide over vast stretches of geologic time. It's yet another concept that's easy.
One thing is crazy that I guess, I don't know for sure, but it's less than 100 years we know about the placas tectônicas. I don't know in English the name, but you know how you know what I'm talking about. But it's only 100 years. We know nothing about nothing. It's very crazy.
For us to take for granted, but which is actually a relatively recent addition to our understanding of the world. In fact, plate tectonics only became widely accepted in the late 1960s, more than half a century after Wallace's death, and also around the time when I was born, which means
years.
I'm as old as plate tectonics. We now know that plate tectonics shapes our planet in many ways, including forming and deforming continents, raising up island chains, and building mountain ranges. And studies have shown the Malay Archipelago to be one of the most complex tectonic regions in the world, a meeting point of multiple plates all jostling for space. And this is responsible for not only the area's many volcanoes and frequent seismic activity, but also the peculiar contrasts of its animal life. Because by the 1980s, scientists were able to say with confidence that the Wallace Line is, at its core, a result of plate tectonics. Wallace had correctly identified that two former continuous landmasses had existed on either side of this line in the deep past. Today we know them as the paleocontinents of Sunda in the west and Sahul in the east, both of which existed during the ice ages when more water was locked up in ice and sea levels were lower.
It's crazy because how the animals know about that? I know they don't know. I know that, but it's crazy how everything is connecting. It's too complex. Life.
Wallace didn't know it, but while they're pretty close now, the two partly sunken continents used to be much, much further apart. The Sahul continent of the eastern side of the line encompassed Australia, Tasmania, New Guinea, and the Aru Islands. And it only...
Sorry, stopping a lot, but maybe in the future they're gonna merge. Merge is the correct word? I don't know, but they're going to connect, and all the species will connect to each other.
He approached the Asian Sunda continental shelf in the west around 20 to 25 million years ago in the late Oligocene or early Miocene epoch. This was a result of the Australian plate slowly drifting north over tens of millions of years after breaking away from Antarctica in the south, bringing its distinctive community of birds, reptiles, and marsupials with it. So even though the species of each side are neighbors now, they've been evolving separately for eons, their two worlds only colliding fairly recently in evolutionary terms. And in between them, immediately east of the line, a complex force of plate tectonics created a chain of new islands in an area of the archipelago that's now called Wallacea. These oceanic islands differ from the continental islands that flank them in that they were never connected to either of the greater landmasses. They were ecological blank slates, waiting to be filled in with whatever creatures could make it there. And those ended up being mostly species from the Australian side, seeing as the Wallace Line acted as a barrier to Asian species moving east. Take, for instance, the Komodo dragon, a giant monitor lizard that today lives on a handful of islands in eastern Indonesia. Their fossils first appear in mainland Australia more than 3 million years ago in the Pliocene epoch, only reaching their current Indonesian island home in the Wallacea region around 1 million years ago. And even now, the deep waters with strong currents that weave between the two regions, including the strait between Lombok and Bali, still limit the dispersal of many species across the line, keeping the differences in their evolutionary history so strikingly visible. This is what created the stark contrast bisecting the jumble of islands that Wallace first sketched out in 1859, and that still fascinates biogeographers today. Wallace's invisible line may not be real in a physical sense, but it shows just how loudly ancient geological events can echo through time, and how they shape the diversity and distribution of life in strange and contrasting ways. And while Darwin might get virtually all the credit as the guy who figured out how species came to be, Wallace is still recognized as a pioneer in figuring out how species came to be where they are. So plate tectonics also explains why Earth has supercontinents. You can celebrate this fact with our Saga of the Supercontinents poster that features 4 of these continental configurations. Available now at dftba.com. And thanks to this month's top-of-the-line eontologists. I'm gonna have to set up a meeting with Callie and me and Joanne from HR, because it's not okay that she's making me say these puns. Raphael Hassa, Jake Hart, Juan M., Annie and Eric Higgins, John Davison Ing, and Melanie Lamb Carnevale. Become an Eonite at patreon.com/eons and you can get fun perks like submitting a joke for me to read. Here's one from Sonia. You can't blame barnacles for being clingy. They're just a tiny shellfish.
Guys,
Once again,
I didn't get the joke, but that's the end of the video. Let's talk about a little bit, just to practice my English. So it's fascinating, how life, it's the evolution, everything. It's the planet, the universe, everything is too crazy, It's too crazy. If we live in a matrix, the computer who runs the matrix is insane, because the levels of complexity getting higher and higher and higher and higher. With the James Webb, I don't know in English a lot of words, sorry about that, but with the James Webb, I guess a lot of you know what I'm talking about. The complexity of the universe is getting expanded. It's crazy, But I like. It's, how I can say that? I feel small and big in the same time, that I know it's like Socrates. I know, how can I say that in English? Eu só sei que nada sei. I only know that I don't know. I don't know if it's correct in English, but in Portuguese it's eu só sei que nada sei. It's like when I try to learn something, I get the point that I know less than I was before learning something, because you get deeper and the knowledge expands. I don't know if that makes sense at all, but it's good to practice my English, But guys, check out then. It's a great video. They explain very well. I'm not a very good in English, and I understand everything they explain very well. And subscribe. Check out them. They 2.8 million in one day. It's crazy. But I love to see stuff like that, you know, the science getting views. It's very good. So guys, thumbs up. I see you in the next reaction.